Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. How are you doing? That is the question I get all the time, whether it was yesterday on our Zoom call that was part of our Sunday school class. Everybody said, how are you doing? My wife and I out for a walk, and everybody that we run into, and not a lot, but probably a few more people out walking than normally on a Monday, all asking the same question, how you doing? So I'd love to know how you're doing, and if you would like to share that, of course, we broadcast on Facebook Live, so you can leave a note there if you'd like to give us a call, 800-351-1212. Let me give you kind of an overview of what's going to happen today. First of all, I think you would probably want me to say a little bit about the coronavirus, the virus crisis, as I'm starting to call it, since people are getting tired of hearing the name, so that's fine. We can come up with all sorts of alternatives, so we'll talk about this. Where are we in terms of the number of cases? The attempt in Congress to actually pass a stimulus bill that was delayed because of a filibuster coming from those Democrats who, of course, back to one of our favorite phrases, never let a crisis go to waste. So we're going to talk about that. Then what about controlling the narrative? There are some real issues surfacing now as to whether or not, if you are maybe a little more optimistic about the future, you may get shut down on Twitter or Facebook or some social media, so we'll talk about that. A couple of studies and surveys and, if you will, even programs that have been trying to get a sense of where this would go. And so I want to give you some of that information as well. And along the way, we also want to give some attaboys to a number of individuals and corporations that have done some good during any kind of crisis, whether it's a tornado or a hurricane, an earthquake, or in this case, a pandemic. It sometimes brings out the best of people and the worst of people. Sadly, we almost always hear about the worst of people in the mainstream media, and hoarding and probably a lot of other issues are going to surface over time, so those will be in the news. So I do want to talk about some of the positives, and we'll get into that in just a few minutes as well. But whenever I just even try to put numbers out, I have people, at least when I do on my Facebook, saying, stop fear-mongering. Well, these are the numbers, or this is just you're part of your left-wing agenda. Well, no, it's not. It's just these are the numbers, okay? And this is, again, coming from Johns Hopkins University. They've been doing a favor by collecting data from all over the world. And so the estimates are that we have 354,000 cases worldwide. About 35,000 of those in the United States. So if that puts it in perspective, about 10% of all the cases of the COVID-19 are found in the United States, primarily in just a couple of states, by the way, I might mention. If you look at the deaths, out of 354,000, we have 15,436 deaths as just a few minutes ago. 5,400 from Italy, 3,100 from China, 2,200 from Spain, 1,800 from Iran. And over 100,000 people that have had the COVID-19 virus have recovered, 100,462. Those are the numbers. Now, as many of you may know, if you're listening, especially in the Texas area, since this is primarily our Texas broadcast this hour, although I'm not ignoring the rest of you outside of the state of Texas. I appreciate those of you that tune in from all over the country, usually on the internet or from a couple of other radio stations, but the predominant audience right this hour from 12 to 1 is primarily a Texas audience. A very significant number of them are a Dallas audience, by the way. And certainly you would be aware of the fact that we are now moving towards something that will be implemented actually just about 12 hours from now, and that is shelter in place, which would basically say you stay home unless you're part of an essential service. Now, I love the list of essential services. You would have certainly expect essential services to be doctors and nurses, even people that are delivering material, people in the food industry, truckers, those that are trying to provide that. But on that long list also, liquor stores, really? Essential services. By the way, churches are not essential services. Matter of fact, I'm hoping that they won't consider this radio program not an essential service. Technically, media and radio fit into that category. But nevertheless, that's where we find ourselves right now. And so that is something I will talk about to the national audience a little bit later, because we are set up for the possibility that I would actually be sitting at home doing this broadcast. But at the same time, there are, at least from our building manager, every reason to assume that I'll just be sitting at this table. But we will have a plan B and probably even a C and a D ready for that as well. So just real quickly, I thought I'd mention that. And while we're doing so, when people say, well, I don't think I'll get the virus. Oh, yes. This one comes out of Florida college students test positive for the coronavirus after going on spring break. All those kids frolicking on spring break, yes, guess what? We already have, I'll just use University of Tampa as one example, already 5 students that we know of that have tested positive for the coronavirus. And of course, you recognize that it's going to take a few more days, because if you do the test, sometimes now we have faster tests that tell you within 45 minutes. Most of these you'd have to wait a few days. So you can already see that we are talking about individuals that were out there on the beach that actually now have tested positive. You might say, well, they're young, so hopefully they'll recover. Yes, we hope that they will. And maybe the mortality rate is low, but we're starting to recognize that the morbidity rate is a little bit higher. Now, what do I mean by that? It means that you won't die, but suppose you were a smoker or you've been vaping. That's another thing people are starting to identify now. And a little bit later, I'm going to give you a little bit of the medical stuff on some of this. That might actually cause your lungs to be more susceptible, so that you may end up have scarring in your lungs for the rest of your life for that spring break trip. So think about that one as well. The data that we have right now, of course, recognizes that if we use the Chinese data, a little bit later, I'm going to talk about why we don't necessarily want to trust it. But if nothing else, we look at about 43,000 people in China that have tested positive without having immediate symptoms. So it does suggest, if those numbers are extrapolating worldwide, and there's a big if there, but if that's the case, then it means maybe a third of all coronavirus cases may be just simply silent carriers. You may, in other words, have the virus. You may be actually passing the virus on and not necessarily be aware that you are actually positive for the virus. And the only way we would know that is by more extensive testing. But just before we take a break, all the way through, I want to talk about good things that people have done. And chloroquine is a tablet that is used to treat people with malaria. It's actually been a drug that's been used for about 85 years. And the other day, Bayer actually donated 3 million chloroquine tablets to fight against the coronavirus. Now, more recently, the Israeli pharmaceutical company donated 6 million doses of that to the United States to treat the coronavirus. It is not a perfect treatment. Of course, clinical tests are going on right now, but it does seem to inhibit the coronavirus from implementing and going into the cells. So it might at least be something that can be used as we are developing other kinds of vaccines. So if nothing else, the big pharma like Bayer, Aspirin, and Bayer, okay, they donated 3 million. Israel, the one that everybody wants to disinvest from, that company donated 6 million. So 3 cheer attaboy from Point of View. We'll have a lot more to talk about right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Let me begin with a question. What do you think of the Trump administration's response to the coronavirus pandemic? Your response probably ranges from a belief that some of the government's actions could have been better to a belief that it was a botched operation from the beginning. Many pundits and politicians say the administration's response has been a disaster. That harsh assessment may be overdone and unfair, but let's assume that it's accurate. That leads to a second question. If the federal government botched this health care response, why would you want the same government to take control of your personal health care? After all, the government had weeks of advanced planning, had lots of international attention, and had access to some of the best disease experts in the government. If you have a personal health care crisis and need surgery or other treatment, your plight won't be given media attention and you won't have access to the best experts in the field. Pundits and politicians critical of the administration might argue that President Trump is solely responsible for all the problems they list. In order to argue that, you would have to ignore the positive comments by experts about the value of the travel bans and even the establishment of the public-private response to the pandemic. Those who argue that another president would have done better ignore some of the mistakes made by previous presidents concerning disasters and pandemics. And do we really think that a Democrat socialist who has never run a government agency or a former vice president apparently dealing with mental and memory issues would do better? And if we do get a vaccine in the near future, it will probably come from the pharmaceutical companies these two candidates often vilify. These critics might want to pause and consider that their criticisms are making a good case against government-run health care. I'm Kerby Anderson. That's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And once again, just thought we would spend a little bit more time talking about a couple of the implications of what we're talking about, and then I want to move our focus on what is happening in Congress right now, or probably better said, what is not happening in Congress right now because of the mindset that never let a crisis go to waste, and we'll get into this in some detail. And, of course, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. At the top of the hour, I'm going to give a couple of announcements, one of which is Kelly Shackelford came back with a few clarifications of some things he said on Monday, on Friday, and we'll say those on Monday, but I wanted to save that for the national audience since he said it then. But here's the first concern, and that is what happens when, if indeed we do not, if you will, bend the curve, if we do not actually lower the number of individuals who are now straining the healthcare situation. More people have died in Italy than anywhere else. And this one coming from the Jerusalem Post, something posted by an Israeli doctor who actually told Israeli television that in northern Italy, the orders are not to allow those over the age of 60 to have access to respiratory machines. If you don't have enough ventilators, then the issue is, well, then you have to start engaging in what I guess you could call triage. And so if you're over the age of 60, then you don't have as many individuals that are actually on ventilators. And, of course, that's what happens when you have a significant crisis. One of the things I posted on my Facebook page was a piece that came out the other day that was comparing, if you will, that one of the things that might happen after the first 10 deaths, and so it was kind of an extrapolation looking at a country that has done very well, that would be South Korea, and compare that to a country that has had real problems, and that would be Italy. If you look at that, what you end up finding, interestingly enough, is actually about halfway between. So there are some ways in which the United States is not looking as bad as Italy, but it also isn't looking as good as South Korea, if indeed the trend continues. Now, I've had some people react to that and say, yeah, but if you look at this, that's due to testing. And at first when I read that, I said, no, these are the actual deaths. So it's not talking. And then I thought, well, maybe what he might mean is because we can test more people, then we describe those people as dying of the coronavirus. And that is another issue with Italy. Some people said, why is Italy so much higher? It could be, well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, one of the oldest populations in Europe, a lot of smokers, a lot of population density and the rest. But part of it also could be the way in which we actually in Italy and also, by the way, in the United States, list something. If you die of some kind of heart attack or pneumonia, but you have the coronavirus, you're listed as dying from the COVID-19. So I understand that could be part of it, but I do believe that if you want to do the best, as best we can, an apples-to-apples comparison, comparing the number of deaths over time, say in places like South Korea or Germany, Italy, France, Spain, whatever, to the United States, I think shows that we aren't as bad as Italy yet, but unless we do some very significant social distancing, that certainly could be a concern in the future. By the way, I might take some phone calls in just a minute, 1-800-351-1212, but let me just mention one other. As people are looking down the road, they wonder, will the 2020 Summer Olympics in Tokyo go off as planned, or will they be postponed? So far, what we're hearing from the International Olympic Committee is canceling them is not on the agenda, but you're starting to hear a growing drumbeat from, if nothing else, the coaches themselves saying, look, it's just getting harder and harder for our athletes, swim coach, for example, the other day, to actually practice, and that is certainly the case. And so the possibility could be that they would be postponed a year, but we'll see. So that's one of the things that we're going to kind of watch along the way as well. And in just a minute, I want to spend some time talking about this whole political issue, because this has been politicized, and we'll talk about that. But let's take a phone call. We'll head up to Ohio first. Sean, I think you have some comments, so give us an update on what you've been finding out up there.
Well, Mr. Kerby, I appreciate you taking my call, and thank you very much. You're doing an excellent job, sir. Real quick, it's been told to me on social media that the churches are closed because they're considered non-essential, but the mosques are open. Can you confirm any of that? I thank you for taking my call, sir.
I have not heard that, but let's do some research on it and find out. One of the things I am finding out is sometimes in social media, people are making statements that aren't true. So I'll see if I can figure that out. And Ohio is an example I'm going to use in just a few minutes, interestingly enough, so I just thought I'd drop it in. But one of the myths that's been running around is that the federal government was talking about implementing a total lockdown, and that made a lot of press, and there were a lot of people repeating that in social media. But I found enough people that are part of the government saying, no, that wasn't even a conversation. So that is something that has been proposed. So I'll find out about that in terms of how mosques are treated compared to churches. And, of course, one of the things that we have seen, and we were talking about this on Friday with Kelly Shackelford, is you had the governor of Kentucky saying that all houses of worship should be closed down. But instead of saying that, he said churches. So the implication is that other houses of worship, like synagogues or mosques, wouldn't be closed down, but only churches would. And if indeed that's the case, it relates exactly to what Kelly Shackelford has been pointing out on his website, the information on guidelines. You know, if everybody else has to be closed down, well, then churches can be closed down as well. But if you're only closing down churches, and that one caused the governor of Kentucky to maybe step back a little bit, then you have a difficulty. But let's, if we can, get to one of the issues I want to put on the table before the break, And that is, you've heard us say so many times that Rahm Emanuel, who was the chief of staff for Barack Obama, made the very clear statement that you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And the argument he was making at the time was the 2008 financial crisis. But there are a lot of people right now that are starting to believe that as well. And the first example we want to talk about is what's happening in Congress. There are reporters that have said that the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, was as angry as they've ever seen him. Now, he is an individual that I think has done a pretty good job sometimes of keeping his temper, but he was pretty upset when he actually came to the Senate floor and said, "Are you kidding me?" And he then began to tick off all the items on what was called the Democratic wish list. Now, I will go through those, but basically he said Democrats won't let us fund hospitals or save small businesses unless they get to dust off the Green New Deal. And he was talking about some of the things being proposed in that particular issue. I've been hearing about this, and so I was looking for somebody to actually give me the list. So I'll give credit to Guy Benson, who put this on a Twitter post, because there's quite a few, but I'll just talk about three before we take a break. Number one, the bill is being held up because they have amendments that they want implemented that would give unprecedented collective bargaining power to unions, which, of course, has nothing to do with the coronavirus stimulus bill. Number two, this one really caused me to roll my eyes, that it would actually call for, this is an amendment that has to be in the bill or they won't pass it, increased fuel emission standards for the airlines at a time when I'm afraid some of these airlines are going to go broke. And if that doesn't completely cause you to just wonder about the sanity of what is happening in Congress, the third one, and I can again validate that because I've heard other people mention as well, the expansion of wind and solar tax credits, which have to be part of the bill. And so this is just getting ridiculous and is, I think, the reason why now you have individuals like the Senate Majority Leader and others who simply say this is ridiculous. And more to the point, as some commentators have pointed out, the last time we provided tax credits for wind and solar, they turned out to be such a dramatic failure. Solyndra, does that ring a bell to you? And so whether you're talking about Chuck Schumer in the Senate or Nancy Pelosi in the House, this is one of the big issues that is actually right now holding up the actual bill, which would provide at least some kind of stimulus in the midst of the virus crisis. But when we come back from the break, I want to talk about some others that aren't happening in Capitol Hill. There is a group that are actually working to try to spend millions of dollars on negative ads about the president, and others that are trying to implement other kinds of progressive wish lists. So we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Never let a serious crisis go to waste, and that's kind of what we're hearing about right now. And this particular article, and maybe I'll post it tomorrow if we think we need it, but again, I think you already get the idea that there are individuals who not so long ago were saying this was a good idea, but now want to add all sorts of extra things into the stimulus bill. And we're talking about what's called Phase 3 stimulus package. And because it was filibuster, basically, it was a 47 to 47 vote. By the way, you might say, why aren't all the senators there? Well, some of them are sequestered. As a matter of fact, interestingly enough, Rand Paul is actually tested positive for the coronavirus. Others are in quarantine. And this particular writer, Christian Detok, he's with the radio broadcaster, he says, reporters on the Hill are saying Leader McConnell is angrier than they've ever seen him because, again, a few hours before, about 10 hours before this vote, you have Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, praising the bipartisan compromise and then actually calls for there to be a filibuster to prevent it. They could not pass what's called a cloture vote, and that was the end of that. One of the things I have in a commentary coming out next week is just the need for us to have some discernment because, after all, Senator Schumer made the point that he didn't like this bill because it provided a bailout to major corporations. But as I just showed you just a minute ago, what is really fueling, as many people are pointing out, this attempt is really to negotiate an attempt to actually increase collective bargaining powers for the unions, to increase the fuel emission standards for airlines, and to expand even further wind and solar tax credits, all of which, of course, have nothing to do with the coronavirus. That comes from Guy Benson. But I love his other response to this as well. He says, not only are these completely unrelated, he's quoting from a source here on Capitol Hill, are they not only completely unrelated to the coronavirus epidemic, they could actually prevent companies from participating in the loan programs altogether, directly causing unnecessarily layoffs. So not only will it not do any good, probably will do some harm. Which brings us to a couple of other things which we mentioned on Friday, but let me bring them up here again because some of those came up on the third hour Friday, and you may not have had a chance to hear it. And the first is that there is just a real attempt right now to use anything about the coronavirus against the president. And probably the best way to illustrate this is on Friday, Gary Bauer said, really, the tale of two war rooms. He says President Trump and Vice President Pence have put together an impressive war room of top medical experts along with leaders of corporate America to direct the battle against the coronavirus. Every day they brief the American people at least once, often twice. I can tell you from personal knowledge, Gary Bauer says, that the team at the White House, including the president and vice president, are probably working 18 to 20 hours a day. Please pray for them, for their health and their families. There's some indication the American people who have been deeply divided are watching this and reevaluating their views of the administration. Gary Bauer points out, for example, if you look at the Harris poll, said that the president's approval was at 46% last month. Now it's at 53%. On the question in that poll of how President Trump is handling the coronavirus emergency, 56% of Americans gave the president a positive rating. Those who say they trust information at the White House is up to 61%. Also, an ABC News poll finds a similar result, found 55% of Americans approve of President Trump's handling of the virus crisis. So that's the first war room. Gary Bauer then talks about there's a second war room, one set up by the left. Reading this, you might think, great, they're joining the battle against the virus too. He says, sadly, you'd be wrong. This war room has one purpose, to hurt the Trump-Pence administration. It is staffed by former aides to Elizabeth Warren and Hillary Clinton. It is funded by so-called dark money that is difficult to trace. They're getting together several times a day to plot attacks against whatever decisions the administration makes. This group and allied organizations are running negative ads in multiple states. And he says, I've been around Washington a long time. Yes, he has, since the 1980s. And I've seen a lot of examples of craven politics, but he says, I've never seen anything like this. My commentary coming out next week talks about that in some detail because you have this Democrat-aligned super PAC wants to spend about $5 million on negative ads about President Trump's response to the coronavirus. And again, the money comes from what's called liberal dark money. In other words, they send money back and forth, so it's really hard to actually even see exactly who's funding it, and are spreading a lot of misinformation. And if you saw that Twitter ad the other day that came out against the president, which was factually incorrect, to say that they're spreading misinformation is actually a very soft term, a very polite term for what most people would call lying or complete deception. So we'll see where that takes us. But in the meantime, that's not enough. Politicians also have been wanting to use this crisis to do a number of things. Mayor Bill de Blasio, of course, who's the mayor of New York, has been trying to make the case for this is why we need to nationalize crucial industries in this country. Nationalize industries. That sure sounds like socialism. Of course, you have socialists like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez arguing that this current health care crisis illustrates why we need a single-payer universal health care program controlled by the federal government. You might want to see my Viewpoints commentary today, where I'm arguing that every time they criticize the administration or the president for the handling of this, whether it's pundits or politicians, they're really making a case for not having the federal government. If you think the federal government failed when this has been in the news for weeks, there's been international focus, there have been all the experts on board, and if you think they failed then, what chance do you think you have when the media is not going to be paying attention to your health care crisis, your personal health care crisis, and you won't have access to all those experts? I think it illustrates that only so well. But not to be completely finished here, for our listeners in Illinois, you know there is a mayor there that has declared that the coronavirus emergency has now allowed her to ban the sale of guns. And, of course, a number of members in Congress, as well as some mayors now, are arguing that we need to be engaged in the commutation of sentences to release prisoners before the virus crisis. And you've had a number of district attorneys that have already announced a reduction in arrests for what were considered to be low-level nonviolent crimes. I guess the argument being that if indeed somebody has the coronavirus, we don't want the police to even get around some of those criminals. And so in an effort, just before we take a break, to maybe put a smile on your face, this came out from the Free Beacon the other day, 10 common sense solutions to the economic crisis caused by China. This is a parody. Can I say this now? It's satire. It's a parody. They're not serious, but they're taking the very statements that the Democrats have made and said, oh, well, then let's do this. Okay? Number one, tax cuts. In an effort to provide much needed relief for struggling hedge funds and other high-frequency traders, a permanent holiday on all capital gains taxes should be implemented immediately. You don't quite get the joke yet until you get to number two, firearms for all. In addition to, or perhaps instead of sending checks to all Americans, the government should be providing complimentary firearms to all citizens, particularly the most vulnerable. As soon as I read that, I said, okay, I know they're joking now. Number three, move the embassy again. We don't know when Israeli scientists will develop a vaccine for the coronavirus, but when they do, America should reward them by moving the U.S. embassy to East Jerusalem, to show, if you will, the Arabs that we're serious. Number three, war. We urge Congress to ask Senators Tom Cotton and Ted Cruz to draft an emergency declaration of war against Iran and to attach it to an amendment on the bailout bill. Then number five, real criminal justice reform. They say, okay, since they say let's empty the prisons, they said, well, our prisons are too crowded. They risk becoming a breeding ground for the virus. So President Trump should immediately pardon low-level criminals such as Michael Flynn, Roger Stone, George Papadopoulos, Paul Manafort. Number six, repeal the Endangered Species Act. You know, if you're going to mention environmental issues, why not? We'll get rid of that. America needs to extract as much fossil fuel energy as possible so that we can fuel our hospitals and make sure we can turn on the lights. So let's get rid of the Endangered Species Act. Number seven, end tenure for teachers and professors. Schools and universities need workforce flexibility, so let's end tenure for teachers. Number eight, healthcare justice. Moments of the crisis require national cohesion. Accordingly, the American people shouldn't have been constantly triggered by the healthcare law named after the president who failed to provide some other issues. So, again, they want to move that from being called, I guess they want to call it not Obamacare, but Melania Care. Then government waste. Now's the time to cut off the government spigot. And so they want to defund the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, National Public Radio. And number 10, election scrutiny. One of the most effective ways to contain the spread is to postpone the 2020 election. It's all a parody. Unfortunately, it sounds just like the flip side of something that at least progressives are very serious about. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention, as a program note at the top of the hour, we're going to have Patrick Morley with us. It is a book called The Christian Man. He got together with all sorts of Christian men, about 24 of those, and on a whiteboard said, okay, what are the kinds of questions that men are asking that we can provide a biblical answer to? And came up with 10, and this book, I think, is going to be really helpful. It's kind of in the process of some of the conversation we've had about as this gets over, we need to really develop a men's ministry. We talked about that last week with Jim Cody. Of course, we've talked about and been promoting the idea of the Promise Keepers event that is taking place July 31st and August 1st right here in the Dallas area. So those are some topics that we'll be talking about with him. Then Jordan Raynor will be with us, Master of One, to really understand what your gifting is. And so I think that will be a way to take a little bit of a break from the kind of conversation that we're having today about the coronavirus and the crisis that is developed in our country and around the world. So we'll be talking about that every single day. here where we'll obviously give you an update on that, but there are other things that we need to learn as we grow as Christians. And I might just point you to a couple of the articles we posted. One, The Virus Crisis in American Society. That comes from the Free Beacon. And I think just as a disclaimer, once again, what I just read to you a minute ago from the Free Beacon was a parody, but it is becoming more and more interesting that you're getting more and more of these really extreme statements being made by people at the moment on the left. We can see some extreme statements on the right, too, but I'll talk about those. It's almost hard to come up with a satire or a parody. Saturday Night Live, The Onion. One of the reasons I think people are so upset with Babylon Bee, which is a satirical website, is because it's sometimes when they're doing the satire is just a little too close to exactly what people are saying. And so the editors there at the Washington Free Beacon decided to have a little fun and come up with 10 solutions that is just sort of the parallel opposite of what is actually seriously being suggested by Democrats and progressives and socialists. And if you found those to be just extreme and bizarre, just see how that in some respects illustrates exactly what we're talking about here. In a minute, I'm also going to read another piece from a part that I've posted here on Christians Will Get Through This. But some of you are wondering, what kind of narrative are we going to get in the future? And there is a concern that was surfaced the other day by the Wall Street Journal, because over the weekend, a web publishing platform known as Medium actually took down an article which was entitled Evidence Over Hysteria, COVID-19. And it was something that had been viewed millions of times. It was done by a Silicon Valley technologist, Aaron Ginn, or Jin, I guess maybe is how he pronounced his name. And it was really an exhaustive case, they say, of optimism about the coronavirus. It highlighted some of the more hopeful estimates, mostly from good authorities, about the virus's growth rate, severity, transmissibility, and responsiveness. But, of course, it then was triggered as something that was under investigation or found to be in violation of the rules. And so now sort of the de facto assumption is that you only can post sort of more negative things on some social media sites. This is only starting, so I don't want to overplay this. But again, one of the things that the editors of the Wall Street Journal point out is the problem is this has been changing day to day. Remember that the World Health Organization, and by the way, I have a commentary coming out next week on that as well, and in particular, the leader of the World Health Organization, who, by the way, does not have a medical degree and has never had any experience at all dealing with global health issues, by the way, was actually saying that the Chinese authorities had found no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission, even back in January, when, frankly, we knew that was the case. So sometimes what you have are individuals that are wanting to make sure that the message is correct. And, of course, the message may be wrong in that particular case. One of the big questions people are asking is, when is it going to end? Do you think I have an answer? No. But will it recede when the spring arrives? Nobody wants to say that. But interestingly enough, our friend John Lott, who is quite the statistician, has pointed out that of the 7 pre-existing coronaviruses that do affect humans, at least 4 are seasonal. So can we predict that? A lot of people say, well, we'll just have to wait. Well, John Lott said, no, we don't. What's going on in the southern hemisphere right now? Summer. I've got our next door neighbors are in Australia right now. They're wearing short sleeve shirts coming back this week. And so looking at the data, he found that countries in the northern hemisphere have higher death rates than those in the southern hemisphere. The most southern countries have approximately 80% fewer deaths per capita than the southern European countries. And these trends, he points out, are statistically significant. Now, what's so interesting is that the further north you move, even in the northern hemisphere, you see something, because the 5 northernmost countries, and that would be Iceland, Finland, Norway, Russia, and Sweden, have among the lowest death rates than some of the 5 southernmost countries like Argentina, Chile, New Zealand, Paraguay, South Africa. And so, there are all sorts of possible reasons for that as well. They also, of course, found something else. Countries with older populations are much more vulnerable. Each 1% increase or in the share of over 65 population is associated with a 5% increase in the country's per capita death rate. And again, showing the impact of the travel restrictions and a number of other things. So kind of interesting to see how some people are willing to try to answer questions even before we've even gotten into our spring and summer months. But my final piece here is Christians will get through this. It's written by Peter Wolfgang, and he points out that when he was 8 years of age, he was in the second grade back then, his mother took him to the Hartford Civic Center, and the roof had collapsed. And interestingly enough, the night before, you had thousands of people watching the University of Connecticut men's basketball game. His best friend was there. His uncle was there. If it had collapsed then, would have been an incredible loss of life. But the grandmother took him there and said this was a sign of human frailty. She says, man thinks he's in charge, but he is not. Remember the Tower of Babel? Whenever we start to think like that, God will humble us. And he points out in this piece, which I would like to encourage you to read in its entirety, he says, Christians are, he says, I believe, best prepared psychologically, emotionally, spiritually to weather the present crisis than many of our other fellows. And he says, for one reason, because we believe in God, not the great one up there or not the great whatever, but the great I am. And number two, because Christians have kind of been here before. He says an upheaval in our financial and political systems disorients all of us. We all just like being isolated from one another. But he said this is not our first rodeo. We've seen the world already turn upside down. In the past few years, we've seen marriage redefined, nuns told to provide abortion drugs, the White House bathed in rainbow colors, biological boys competing against girls in girls' high school sports, drag queen story hour. Goes through this long, long list. But he reminds us that, if anything, I think Christians are the ones that maybe can stand strong. And over these last couple of weeks, I bet at least one time you've said or heard somebody say, I don't know how somebody who doesn't believe in the Lord could even begin to deal with this right now. So if nothing else, let me encourage those of you that are Christians listening to be a source of strength, maybe reach out to some people in your community and make a difference, because there are great stories, some of which I'll try to share over the next couple of days, of people that have been doing very good things, Christians that have been doing very good things and reaching out to their community. Again, I sometimes wonder, if I didn't know the Lord, what would I be thinking right now? Let's take a break, though. We're going to be talking with Patrick Morley. That coming up right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
How are you doing? That's a question I keep getting asked all the time. Yesterday, even when our own Sunday school class was on with Zoom, there were people saying, how you doing? And everybody was kind of checking in with everybody. As my wife and I were out walking today, every time I ran into somebody, I said, how are you doing? Because everybody wants to know how you're doing, and I'd love to know how you were doing today. You can obviously leave a note if you'd like on our website, pointofview.net. Of course, we also broadcast on Facebook Live. If you'd like to leave a note, I appreciate some of those and just kind of like to see how it is all happening, because even though we are in the midst of a virus crisis, we're still going to continue broadcasting. As a matter of fact, I'm really excited about this. Over these next 2 weeks, we've just got an incredible lineup of guests. And so if you find yourself sequestered at home, maybe you're in one of those places as this studio is supposed to be in terms of shelter in place. Of course, we broadcast from Dallas. We're in Dallas County, and they decided that starting tonight, we will have shelter in place. But they've made an exception, of course, for media, and radio fits into that. But we've also gone to a plan B. If I have to broadcast from home, we'll see what we can do there. So we did want to give you a sense that if indeed I'm broadcasting from home, hopefully I'll use the same kind of microphone. Hopefully it'll sound the same, but it could be a little bit different. I'm hoping that we can be in the studio tomorrow. We were hoping to be in studio with Joe Rosenberg, but because of this, he's now gone back to Israel. So we will be talking to him by phone about his new book. But just again, if you have been paying attention to this, we have 367,000 cases worldwide, about 41,000 in the United States. 16,000 deaths, 6,000 in Italy, 3,000 in China, 2,000 in Spain, but 100,000 plus people that have recovered. And so we won't spend a lot of time today talking about the crisis of the virus, but instead, in just a minute, we're going to be talking with our good friend Patrick Morley about his new book, The Christian Man. But I thought I'd give just a real quick update. That is, we had Kelly Shackelford in studio on Friday, and some of you were asking about these emergency orders. And he pointed out that typically emergency orders do not have penalties. They're really strong suggestions. But he says, he has looked and found a number of orders that do have criminal penalties. But they also, in light of some of the things we've talked about in terms of your church, for example, one example he used is Ohio did have restrictions but exempted religious organizations. But if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about emergency orders, health orders, shelter in place, even a lockdown, you can go to their website, First Liberty, and find out a little bit more. And we're not going to get very political today other than to simply point out that there was an attempt yesterday to try to pass the Phase 3 stimulus package, but it failed on a procedural vote, could not break cloture. And this was such a surprise, if for no other reason than the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, just 10 hours before, had actually praised this bipartisan compromise. But then, because of not only Chuck Schumer, but Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, you have, as some reporters were pointing out, that the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, probably more angry than they've ever seen him before, in part because now they're asking that if indeed they're going to go along with passing this stimulus, they also want, are you ready for this? Unprecedented collective bargaining powers for unions, increased fuel emission standards for airlines, and I'm wondering if the airlines are going to even survive, and expansion of wind and solar credits. The Solyndra spring of mind. And again, as Guy Benson points out, he was interviewing somebody who said not only are these completely unrelated to the coronavirus epidemic, they actually could prevent companies from participating in the loan programs altogether, causing all sorts of unnecessary layoffs. So just a lot to consider. And so today, let me encourage you to go to our website and find a couple of articles. One, Coronavirus Test America's Social Capacity. Very good piece by Matthew Continetti, something to think about. And then number two, one by Peter Wolfgang, Christians Will Get Through This. As a matter of fact, his argument is Christians are probably better prepared psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually to weather the present crisis. So those, I hope, will be an encouragement to you. But I hope also some of the conversation we're going to now have over the next 2 hours will be an encouragement to you, because we bring back to the microphone Patrick Morley, businessman, speaker, and, of course, author of almost 24 books, probably best known for Man in the Mirror, as well as the 7 Seasons of the Man in the Mirror, Devotions for Man in the Mirror, and this new book, The Christian Man, a conversation about the 10 issues men say matter most. Patrick, always great to have you on the program with us.
Thank you, Kerby, and greetings to all of your listeners today as well.
Let's, if we can, talk about how this book came to be, and that is you got together about 24 Christian men, age 24 to 47, most in their mid-30s, Saturday morning, storyboard, and you said, what are the issues and topics that would make you feel compelled to pick up and read a book for men? And so these 10 are the ones that you came together on. But talk about how you came up with the final 10 list.
Yeah. So, excuse me, I got a little frog in my throat here today. And I'm going to just begin by acknowledging the tension, the fear, the anxiety that a lot of men and women are experiencing, and then also the incredible faith that a lot of people are also experiencing. And just want to, again, and tacking on to what you had said earlier, just remind everyone the flowers are still the same color as they were yesterday. The scripture that says, this is the day that the Lord has made, let us rejoice and be glad in it, is still there on good days and bad days. And the verses that say, rejoice always, pray without ceasing, in everything give thanks, for doing these things is the will of God for you in Christ Jesus, is still there. And so for those who are needing a little courage, I hope that something we say here today might add to that as well. So with that said, as a preface, I don't know how many of you out there have ever been in a storyboard, but basically what it does, it democratizes brainstorming. So in brainstorming, basically, people have their ideas, but often the most charismatic person who might have a good idea carries the day, while a more reserved person in the corner may have been afraid to speak up, but they had a really great idea, and then it doesn't get acted on. So what storyboarding does is it gives everybody an equal vote. So we had 24 men. The mode, 6 of the men were 33 years of age,
yes,
so mid-30s. And they came up with about 40 different issues. I asked them to write one issue per Post-it, little yellow Post-its, and then I was the moderator. I stuck them against the wall. We had about 40 issues, and I grouped things together like being a better father or how to be a good dad. That's 2 ways of saying the same thing, obviously. So I grouped them together, and then I gave each of these 24 men 5 little round sticky dots. And by the way, if you're listening and have never done a storyboard, you're going to learn a new skill here, and maybe you can use it, in your business or church group.
Sure. Let me jump in because we have a break coming up, and I want you to explain that because it is something I've used in terms of helping organizations kind of develop a mission statement and things like that. So let's come back and find out a little bit more, and then we're going to go into those 10 issues that men say matter the most. Patrick Morley with us. We'll take a break, come back with him right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Let me begin with a question. What do you think of the Trump administration's response to the coronavirus pandemic? Your response probably ranges from a belief that some of the government's actions could have been better to a belief that it was a botched operation from the beginning. Many pundits and politicians say the administration's response has been a disaster. That harsh assessment may be overdone and unfair, but let's assume that it's accurate. That leads to a second question. If the federal government botched this health care response, why would you want the same government to take control of your personal health care? After all, the government had weeks of advanced planning, had lots of international attention, and had access to some of the best disease experts in the government. If you have a personal health care crisis and need surgery or other treatment, your plight won't be given media attention and you won't have access to the best experts in the field. Pundits and politicians critical of the administration might argue that President Trump is solely responsible for all the problems they list. In order to argue that, you would have to ignore the positive comments by experts about the value of the travel bans and even the establishment of the public-private response to the pandemic. Those who argue that another president would have done better ignore some of the mistakes made by previous presidents concerning disasters and pandemics. And do we really think that a Democrat socialist who has never run a government agency or a former vice president apparently dealing with mental and memory issues would do better? And if we do get a vaccine in the near future, it will probably come from the pharmaceutical companies these two candidates often vilify. These critics might want to pause and consider that their criticisms are making a good case against government-run health care. I'm Kerby Anderson. That's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again with best-selling author, the man in the mirror, Patrick Morley, and we're talking about the new book, The Christian Man, a conversation about the 10 issues men say matter most. It is published by Zondervan. New in the sense that it's been out less than a year, but it has been out quite a while, so you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. But if you are unable to do so or can't get out, we have an opportunity for you to order it in hardback or Kindle. We also, of course, have a link to his website, maninthemirror.org. Patrick, you're talking about this idea of pulling together all these ideas and then kind of using a democratic kind of idea of making sure that you surface it. And as I look through these 10 issues, these are the kind of things that I think not only men but women also are asking about and really want biblical perspectives on, don't they?
Yeah, these are the core issues. So out of the 40 issues that the young men came up with, they each had 5 little round sticky dots, and so I said, go vote your top 5 issues. And so when we stepped away, as always is the case in this process called storyboarding, the issues that really are the most important ones stand out, and there happened to be an even 10. And so that's what ended up being in the book. And then I asked the men also, what are the questions you would like to have answered about identity, about being marriage, about being a father, about work and so forth, the things that they came up with, and that's what ended up in the book.
I might just mention, too, as people might want to apply this for a small group, we have a number of listeners that teach Sunday school classes, small group, and the rest. You have a whole section on reflection and small group discussion, but also all the way through, there's places where you can actually write in your goals based upon particular verses and those kinds of things. So this is just really made for anything from individual study to group study. And again, some of those ideas that we're going to be talking about: identity, life balance, growth, marriage, children, friendships, work, lust, culture, and sharing my faith, kind of the top 10. And let's get into the issue of identity. As I said, this is not just an issue, if you will, for men. I think women deal with this as well. And if nothing else, one of the key verses you use is 2 Corinthians 5:17, that if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation, and the old is gone, the new is here. And so in some respects, we really need to understand what our identity is in Christ, don't we?
Yes, and so most of your listeners, I'm going to guess, will be familiar with that verse, at least at some level. So I have my professional training is I have a PhD in leadership and organizational change, and so I've studied leadership, and a lot of leadership studies are what the chair of my dissertation study used to call glittering generalities. But there are two things in leadership studies that are very interesting over the last 100 years since leadership has been studied as an academic pursuit. I am getting to the question. So the leaders, the first way that leaders were studied was in terms of their attributes or their characteristics. They were humble, or they were strong, or they were courageous, or whatever. And then later, leadership studies changed a little bit and started examining the roles that leaders might play in an organization. And so I've sort of appropriated that paradigm, and so for this chapter on identity, I wanted to help men understand first that who they are in Christ is who they really are, but then also that their identity is made up of the attributes and the roles that God assigns to us. So for the roles, and then I talk about some of my own personal roles that are precious to me. A son of God, that'd be number one, that I'm a son, or if you're a woman listening, a daughter, sons and daughters. And then also for me, being a disciple, a servant, and so forth. And give the men an opportunity to just think through, okay, what are the roles that I feel like are really important to my identity? And I also make the distinction between your obituary identity and your naked before God identity. So.
And I love that because, we know what an obituary looks like. Or, of course, for those of us who've done funerals, that's one thing. But then, like you have the next page, your naked before God identity. And I thought that was really good. And as we go through this, let me just mention that in this particular section, you encourage people to read a particular verse, to write down maybe some goals and a variety of other things. And then there's, of course, reflection and small group discussion questions all the way through. So just some really important issues. But in order to see if we can try to cover all 10, let's go on to the next one, and that is life balance, how to be faithful with everything is entrusted to me. Because in some respects, that was the question that came to my mind. When I first grabbed the book, I thought, well, we'll see if we got one on time-life balance. And that was the second one, because I just knew that would be one that those guys would pick. And it is probably one of the biggest issues people, Dr. Morley, are really dealing with these days, isn't it?
It is, and so it's interesting because this came within one vote of being the top issue. The top issue, interestingly enough, and listeners, if you're a young guy or an older guy, you'll find this interesting. The number one issue among men, these men from 24 to early 40s, was spiritual growth. But number two is life balance. It came within one vote. So that's kind of interesting. And so the idea of the pressures that men are under, and the pressures I talk about in the book, the pressures that Jesus was under, and how Jesus ended up making his decisions based on his priorities, not his pressures. And so we then talk about what are priorities, and then just something very important, how many priorities can one man handle, And so then there are some priorities, though, that are in Scripture that are the priorities of a Christian man. So first and foremost, Jesus was asked, what's the most important thing a man can do in his relationship with God? That's a paraphrase. And he said, well, that's easy. It's to love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. In other words, the totality of your being, every ounce of your energy, the sum of your strength, to bring that to bear on loving God. And so it's fascinating, guys. If you're out there, I don't know about you, but I've been even more deep into my own private devotions with this coronavirus thing that's been going on.
Sure.
It's so interesting. Here's what I've discovered. Vertical alignment counters horizontal distractions. Vertical alignment counters horizontal distractions.
Good line.
Yeah. And so I want to encourage you that you might be thinking, well, I need to scramble. God helps those who help themselves and all that. I really need to be scrambling right now. And that's, you do need to be, innovative. You need to be thinking. You need to be taking care of your family. Everybody's in upheaval. But the anchor of everything, the anchor of having the identity that involves the attributes that God gives us through the Holy Spirit, is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. All of those attributes that we aspire to have, and the courage and the humility that sort of frame them, we get that by this first and top priority of the Christian loving God. It was interesting. I had a guy call me on the phone, Kerby. He said, and this is a man who's in media, by the way. He big-time media guy. He said, hey, Pat, what's the most important thing a guy can do in his relationship with God? And I wrote back, I said, well, who's asking? He said, well, I am. And I said, well, what do you think? And he wrote back, he said, well, that's what I'm trying to figure out. And I said, well, what do the scriptures tell us? And then we got right here to this verse, loving God, and then, of course, the second one, which is then the second priority, obviously, and that's to love one another. So these are the two top priorities. And then in this chapter, I love this chapter. And I should probably mention, too, Kerby, that Zondervan has been so generous. They have allowed me to take this 200-whatever-page book and distill it down into about 30 pages of the most important things that I've learned. It's a little embarrassing after working with men all these decades to say that everything I really have to offer can be distilled down to about 30 pages, but it's true. Yeah. And but they've allowed me to publish a thing we call the Christian Man Coaching Guide, and it's free. It's a free downloadable PDF. And so anybody can go to maninthemirror.org/mentor and download this free coaching guide. You don't have to buy the book. And it has, especially in this particular chapter on life balance, it has a tremendous tool to help you think through, what your life balance should be, what your priorities, what the balance should be between loving God and people. And, of course, that also then goes on to into the other priorities.
Again, maninthemirror.org/mentor, and we'll have that link up there as well. And when we come back, we'll talk about becoming a more kingdom-minded man and some of the other very important issues that men say matter most. We'll be back right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation with Dr. Patrick Morley, and again, author of the best-selling book, Man in the Mirror, but talking about this new book published by Zondervan. It's been out almost a year, but The Christian Man, you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we certainly have a link so you can get it in hardback or Kindle. A conversation about the 10 issues men say matter most. Also, you can go to maninthemirror.org/mentor. We'll put that link up in just a minute as well. And as people go to Man in the Mirror, Dr. Morley, let's, if we can, for just a minute, talk about some of the resources, because as I click on there, I can see that you have church resources, you have leadership training, you have a blog, you have a variety of resources that we have on our website, pointofview.net. So talk about what they will find when they land there.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. And by the way, I'd have a hard time keeping up with you. You have more things going on, and you've done more things than almost anybody I know, so congratulations for a great career. Yeah, it's really phenomenal. So we basically do three things at Man in the Mirror. We serve pastors, we train and equip leaders, and then we help men in personal transformation. So we have a field team of about 100 area directors located in 35 states. We're growing that. I don't think we'll be growing it for the next couple of months, but our men in the field are extremely busy right now with pastors, especially, encouraging them, praying for them, and helping them process how to move from a physical to a virtual environment, at least for the short term, the near term. And so there's a lot of there are many, many resources there for pastors and church leaders. And then we also developed a model called No Man Left Behind.
Yes.
And we've trained 5,000 churches how to use that model all over the country.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And it's basically a way to change how people think about men's ministry. So back in the 50s, when all these men's ministries were getting started by denominations, it's kind of nobody ever asked the question, what about the men that are not interested in a men's only ministry? And so if you were the best, and he was on our staff, so I know what the number is, if you were the best men's ministry pastor in America and you really worked diligently, you would be able to get about 25% of your men engaged. But the question that I was always asking, well, what about the other 75%? And so what we've done is we've developed a model, and I'm a model builder. So we've built a model, and then churches that are using it are able to figure out how to engage men right where they are, even if it's in a couple's home group, for example. It's still ministering to men, you see. And so we call it all-inclusive ministry to men, and so some information on the website about that. And then also lots of different resources. We're not going to be doing live events now. We've canceled all live events for the rest of the year. And but there are lots of small group resources, this book, other books, and I teach a Bible study. We started, Kerby, I don't know how you got started. We started with a Bible study in a bar in 1986, and we're still meeting, not in a bar anymore. And it's virtual. We were one of the early online Bible studies, and so we literally have thousands of men around the world that are in Bible study with me, and I have a couple of co-teachers now every Friday morning at 7 a.m. And your listeners, guys, if you're out there and you're looking for Bible study this week, MIMBiblestudy.org will get you there. And so all these resources are linkable on the on maninthemirror.org. So thank you for asking.
And again, all of it is on our website, too, in case you just happen to be driving right now. Just go to pointofview.net, click on the picture of Patrick Morley, and you'll find everything you need. And I wanted to at least focus on a few more. We may not get all 10, but certainly the most votes was for the one on growth, becoming a more kingdom-minded man. And during the situation we find ourselves in, I love one of the lines there, a Bible a small group and serving someone else will solve 90% of your problems. I love that because in some respects that's the case. When you got God's word, when you're working with accountability and you're serving others, that's really how spiritual growth takes place, isn't it?
Well, I'm looking for big movements. Some people are called to help one small group of guys or maybe one other person, and that is as completely noble as any other calling. I've always wanted to reach large numbers of men, as many men as possible. And so I'm looking for the principles that make big movements. And so now we've worked with thousands of churches, millions of men now over these last few decades. And so if I were to boil it all down, I would say that, if whatever you're facing, men, whatever you're facing out there, a Bible small group and serving someone else will solve 90% of your problems. Now, it's a generalization, right? But we use generalizations. Why? Because they're generally true. Not always, but generally. Mm-hmm. But when somebody calls me on the phone or sends me an email and they're expressing a problem that maybe their marriage is suffering or whatever it is, a child on drugs, whatever it is, the first question I always ask, I said, well, tell me about your Bible reading habits. And, well, typically they will say, to be honest with you, I really haven't been reading the Bible lately. I've been so discouraged. I said, that's all right. But let me ask you a second question. Who's your best friend, or are you in a small group? And inevitably the answer is 100% of the time the same, well, I'm not in a small group. Sometimes they'll say I used to be, but 100% of the time they've moved toward isolation. So men, if you're listening, women, if you're listening, when women have problems, these again are generalizations, but when women have problems, they tend to move toward relationships. But men, when we have problems, we tend to move toward isolation. And anyone who's ever watched the National Geographic Channel knows that the lion never goes after the herd or the pride, the herd. The lion always goes after which one? The one that's become isolated. And so it's kind of a double bind for guys. They don't feel like their life is turning out the way that they had hoped or planned, and so instead of leaning into relationships, they move into isolation, and then like 1 Peter 5:8 says, the devil prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour, not some group to devour, you see. So, so Bible in a small group, and then serving someone else, just real briefly. I was in a real funk early in our marriage. My wife said to me, you know what your problem is? I said, no, tell me what my problem is.
You guys love those questions.
She said this before I had a chance to make a smart remark. She said, you are just so self-absorbed. You need to get out of the house and go do something, help somebody. And bam, just like that, it clicked, and I did. And that day I went down to a local urban ministry. I said, hey, is there something I can do around here to help? And they gave me something to do, and the cloud lifted. So
wow.
Are there other things that are important? Yes, but I have discovered that men, if you'll be in your Bible, read your Bible, be in the Word, and be in a small group and share your struggles and victories too, but with other guys, and serve someone else, that basically everything else will fall into place.
So again, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I thought maybe I'd jump ahead to friendships, because one of the big issues is the friendless American male. It fits very well into that idea of finding and keeping godly friends. In Proverbs 18, there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother, and so that kind of is another application point. And if you find yourself saying, well, you aren't going to cover all 10, that will be kind of obvious, but nevertheless, I would encourage you to get a copy of the book, and you can find out more. Of course, you can also get that 30-page summary, if you will, on mentoring, but we've talked about identity and life balance and growth. We'll come back and talk about friendships, but some of the others are things we've talked about here on Point of View, like marriage and children, work, lust, culture, and sharing your faith. But again, if you would like to know a little bit more about some of these issues, let me encourage you to certainly go to the website, Man in the Mirror, because as you go there, you're going to find all sorts of great resources, church resources, ministry resources, and leadership training. Those are going to be very helpful to you. And as we find ourselves kind of in a virtual world right now, let's encourage you to do that. We're hoping that maybe this summer, once things clear, that the Promise Keepers event that we've been talking about, July 31st and August 1st, will actually take place. But whether that does or not, whether you have a dynamic men's ministry in your church or nothing going at all, I hope that you will take the time to go to maninthemirror.org and find some of those resources. And, of course, when we come back, we'll continue our conversation about this new book published by Zondervan, The Christian Man, conversation about the 10 issues men say matter most. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and again, we want to talk about friendships because that's one of the chapters in the book, Chapter 6. Patrick Morley with us. Again, the book is entitled The Christian Man, and I remember some research when I wrote a book years ago talking about the baby boom generation that an individual was actually surveying men and asked them, do you have a close male friend? And the most typical answer was no. why should I have one? And yet the women put together what I call kind of these steel magnolia friendships almost instantaneously, which has always been, Patrick, why developing a men's ministry has been more difficult, because we sometimes believe that friendships for men are optional, especially the busyness of their lives makes it even less likely that they will have that close male friend like they did when they were growing up as kids.
Yes, that's exactly correct. So, by the way, it's just so much fun talking to you because you're so easy to listen to, number one, and you also have such wisdom and common sense. So thank you for being such a gracious host. I really appreciate it. So, we are made for relationships, and every man knows this intuitively, because he wants to have, first, I always say the three things that men want is they want a cause they can give themselves to, a companion to share that with, and then some kind of a conviction that gives a reasonable explanation for why the first two things are so hard. So men are made for a cause, and so that's kind of like the need to be significant. That's kind of like the top thing, okay? But every man, when he goes off to hunt his bear, but then he wants to come home and show it to his wife and have her, and then brag and have her tell him what a big man he is, So relationships are important, but also male-to-male relationships are extremely important. So at this Bible study that I teach, we have about 100 men live and in 20 different small groups, and we have visitors come each week. And when they first arrive, they're cautious. They're at least reserved and sometimes guarded.
Sure.
But what they find is that when they get into these groups with the other men, and they see how vulnerable and honest and transparent these other men are with each other, and as trust begins to build, and we don't force men to talk. We do not violate what I call the process of relationships. There is a process of relationships, and you need to give people time to become acclimated and for trust to develop before you ask them to, get deep. So we're very careful about that. But what we have, here's what I found, is that men, when they first arrive, they don't think they'll ever want to say anything to anybody, and then a few weeks later, you can't get them to shut up.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, because it's so refreshing to be able to actually talk about issues that really matter. And I think the reason a lot of guys are isolated is because they don't really think anybody cares about them. I would say that, or they don't feel like God really cares about them personally, not really, and so they have withdrawn. They've withdrawn from other people. So, guys and gals were just different. So, my wife, I tell the story in the book. My wife and I, we pulled up to a stoplight one day next to a Lamborghini. So I cracked the window because I wanted to hear that little throaty rumble, from the 700 horsepower engine,
Yes.
And then the light turned green, and man, this driver, he lit it up. And I said, with no small amount of admiration to my wife, I said, "Wow, can you believe that?" And she turned and she looked at me and she said, "No, I can't believe that either. That's just so dangerous." So, guys, it's great to talk to our spouses, but it is also good to get with other guys who are sort of wired the same way we are. So, in this particular chapter, since this is so important, I give a little guide on how to start a one-on-one friendship, and then also, very importantly, how to start and sustain a weekly men's small group. And within the next few days, we'll have a tutorial up on our website on how to do a virtual small group as well. So if you guys are not already in a group, this is a great time. If you're strong, to either join or even lead a group and make a difference in the lives of some other men.
If nothing else, that encourages me that if I want to go to the film Ford versus Ferrari, I want to have you right next to me, since you would appreciate that.
Oh man! So I used to race Porsches. somebody said, well, why did you stop? I said, well, I ran out of money. It's very expensive. But so I did watch that movie. And the most realistic part of that movie is when the chairman, Mr. Ford, was actually in the car, and how scared he was when he was being driven around that airport.
And then crying.
Course.
Yes. So good. Well, anyway, let's, just before we run out of time, talk about how people can use this book. Again, we've covered quite a number of the chapters, but not all of those, and that's why you need to get a copy of the book. We've talked about identity and life balance and growth and friendships. There's things about work and marriage and family and culture and much more. But again, this is written in such a way that individuals like myself, as we go through this, you have an assessment tool and an opportunity for you to evaluate some of this. There's a call to action. There are some goals that you can write in the book if you would like to do so. So it certainly works very well for an individual and a way to adjust and evaluate your priorities and a self-assessment. But this would be just ideal for a small group as well. And even if you can't get together face-to-face, I think we're all starting to use Zoom a little bit more, and you could still make sure everybody has a book and everybody goes through that and then have a discussion time afterwards. So talk about how you can use some of the resources that you have there at Man in the Mirror.
Yeah. Well, the best thing to do is go to maninthemirror.org, and you can look at, the different things. The mentoring experience, which is the website we gave earlier, maninthemirror.org/mentor, is a fantastic tool. You can use the book and the coaching guide, or just the coaching guide, which, again, is free, and you can download it at that website, maninthemirror.org/mentor. And we're hoping to use this book. We're putting it into a program that we have called Books by the Box. So sometime around mid-May, you can check on our website, or you can send me an email at patrickmorley@maninthemirror.org, and I'll put you on the wait list for it. But we'll be selling these books in cases of, I believe it's 12, for under $2 a copy, so that you can give them out to the men in your church, along with a coaching guide, which is reproducible. You can reproduce an unlimited, thank you, Zondervan, unlimited number of free copies of this coaching guide and distribute it around. So that's probably going to be the big idea for the day, is do this book yourself, but also do it in a small group, do it with some other guys, and work through these issues. These are... I don't know how else to say it, but I feel like this is my life's work distilled down to here into one piece, and so come and get it.
Yeah. Patrick Morley, Dr. Morley, it's always great to have you on the program, and it's just great to hear your voice, and just appreciate the work that you've done, starting all the way back to that book, The Man in the Mirror, and all that you've done since then. It's just great to have you on the program.
Thank you, Kerby. God bless you. God bless you, men and women, and stay safe out there.
We're going to take a break, and then when we come back, we're going to talk about the master of one, whether you're a man or a woman. Maybe you're saying, I'm doing a lot of things, but I'm not doing the most important. And so that is a book that I think you're really going to enjoy as well. And so this is a perfect kind of 1-2 look at how to be assessing where you are, and then how to make sure you know what your best gifts and your best calling might be. So we'll be talking about that with Jordan Raynor, and that will be up right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour here on Point of View, we're going to focus on excellence. We're going to talk about priorities and maybe eliminating certain things and focus, because we are created to be the most excellent versions of what God has created us to be. So we're going to spend some time looking at that. And let me just mention that some of the material that you may want to look at later that we've posted on the website, either the interview we did last hour from Dr. Patrick Morley on the Christian man, also some of these articles that I've posted, one on how the coronavirus tests America's social capacity, and then also Christians will get through this, the argument being made by this author, Peter Wolfgang, that Christians are perhaps better prepared psychologically, emotionally, spiritually to weather the present crisis. So we certainly want to encourage you to find some of those articles. And if nothing else, when we talk about excellence, it brings us back to a verse that I've been teaching through just recently in my own Sunday school class in 1 Peter 2:9. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. And so we're going to be talking about this book, The Master of One, and it is written by Jordan Raynor, who is, of course, not only the author of that book, but the national bestseller Called to Create, serves as the executive chairman of a tech startup known as Threshold 360, also has been twice selected as a Google Fellow and served even in the White House under George W. Bush, and recently launched the Call to Mastery podcast, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Jordan, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, it's a joy to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, again, we're going to try to help people kind of focus the one, and that's kind of the idea, the master of one, to find and focus on the work you were created to do. And you talk about the fact that, like a lot of us, you were doing a lot of different things, but finally you needed to actually have a mentor say, you need to find the one thing. Explain that for just a minute, because there are various groups that have been involved with that. There was a movie that sort of had that as one of its themes, interestingly enough, and that's really what your book's all about, isn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, I don't think my story is unique. I think it's quite common. So by the time I was 25 years old, I would have described myself as the quintessential jack of all trades, master of none. I had served in the White House. I had sold my first tech startup as an entrepreneur. I was playing piano at a wine bar in college. I was good at a lot of different things, Kerby, but there was nothing that I could point to say I was really masterful at. And as I talk about in the book, I actually have no problem being described as a jack of all trades. I think that's the inevitable byproduct of finding the work that we can do with excellence for the glory of God. But I do have a big problem being described as a master of none, because the essence of the Christian life, you just said it with 1 Peter 2:9, that's part of the essence of the Christian life, is to proclaim the excellencies of God, to show the world what God is like, and loving and serving our neighbor as ourselves. The opposite of mastery is mediocrity, and mediocrity is nothing short of a failure of love. And so I had this mentor in my life who just sat me down very honestly one day. It was like, Jordan, you're good at a bunch of different things, but what is the thing that you're really going to sink your teeth into? What is the thing you're going to purposely practice for the next 30 years in service of God and neighbor? And I didn't have an answer to that question. And so for about 5 or 6 years, I was really thinking about this, experimenting. And the result of that that experimentation and interviews with some of the world's best performers across athletics, business, and a bunch of other disciplines, I wrote this book to share what I believe is a fairly proven path to finding, focusing, and mastering on the work that we were created to do.
Well, let's see if we can call you back and get a better line, because that one is not working very well. But let me, as we're doing so, just mention that this book, published by Waterbrook, and so you can probably find it in your local bookstore. It just came out recently, and it's got some great stories here that I thought you would appreciate. Tony Dungy's one of the stories there, who's been on the program with us as well. And it is entitled The Master of One, to find and focus on the work that you were created to do. And it's really broken down into a couple of parts. Part one deals with the purpose of mastery and talks about this idea of excellence in all things and even proclaiming the excellencies of God, the one verse I just quoted from just a minute ago. Then it talks about a ministry of excellence, so we'll focus on that. Then the middle part talks about the path to mastery, to start with the one in mind, and then how to explore, how to choose, how to eliminate, and how to master. And then finally, we'll talk about the promise of mastery, the idea of salt and light, the room where it happens, and to share the master's happiness, because this is all part of an attempt to really address those issues. And I think some of you might be saying, well, I think I've sort of figured out what I need to do. But one of the things I will certainly want to talk about with Jordan is the reality that when you get into some of these issues, sometimes the thing that you're supposed to do maybe is only on the horizon and you're not doing it. I could certainly say that it wasn't really until I was in my 30s that I did radio. I think most people think I do that relatively well. So that wasn't something at the age of 25 I was even on the horizon at that point. I had been occasionally on a radio program. That was about it. So there is a sense in which sometimes when we are trying to figure out what we're supposed to do and what God may be leading us to do, that is a very significant challenge. So this is one of the reasons why we want to talk about that. And really, he then talks about some of the unique giftings of individuals, whether it's C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia, whether it's the TV legend Mr. Rogers. Of course, I just mentioned a minute ago the NFL Hall of Fame coach, Tony Dungy, maybe even the reality TV star Chip Gaines, and a variety of others. We certainly have examples, contemporary examples of individuals who have been able to, in one way or another, excel in their abilities. But then also we have some great examples in this book about biblical figures and others, some of whom you have known, others maybe you don't know, a pilot, a teacher, an entrepreneur, a banker. And so I think you're going to find this really helpful. And Jordan, I think we have you back now, but if nothing else, I was giving kind of an overview to the book. And it is one that really is intended for individuals to kind of go through, or maybe even to go through with a group and learn a little bit more about what their gifting might be, and to be, again, the master of one rather than master of none, right?
That's exactly right. Sorry you lost me. This coronavirus quarantine has got me in different places around the house to do these calls. But no, that's exactly right. And you hit on an important point, right? I think a lot of times when we try to discern our career calling, we ask solely, what are we passionate about? But I actually think, I think that's an interesting question, but I think the more important question is, what are we gifted at? If work is service to others, a means of loving our neighbor as ourselves, we ought to be disproportionately interested in the work that we have a high propensity for, right? That we can do with sincere excellence in service of others. And so we talk a lot about that in the book, this idea, maybe we can explore it in another part of this conversation, that, passion follows mastery. We get to love what we do by getting really, really good at it. That's the most proven path of finding work that you love yourself.
We're going to take a break, and then we'll get into the 3 different sections of the book, Master of One, and we'll be back right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Let me begin with a question. What do you think of the Trump administration's response to the coronavirus pandemic? Your response probably ranges from a belief that some of the government's actions could have been better to a belief that it was a botched operation from the beginning. Many pundits and politicians say the administration's response has been a disaster. That harsh assessment may be overdone and unfair, but let's assume that it's accurate. That leads to a second question. If the federal government botched this health care response, why would you want the same government to take control of your personal health care? After all, the government had weeks of advanced planning, had lots of international attention, and had access to some of the best disease experts in the government. If you have a personal health care crisis and need surgery or other treatment, your plight won't be given media attention and you won't have access to the best experts in the field. Pundits and politicians critical of the administration might argue that President Trump is solely responsible for all the problems they list. In order to argue that, you would have to ignore the positive comments by experts about the value of the travel bans and even the establishment of the public-private response to the pandemic. Those who argue that another president would have done better ignore some of the mistakes made by previous presidents concerning disasters and pandemics. And do we really think that a Democrat socialist who has never run a government agency or a former vice president apparently dealing with mental and memory issues would do better? And if we do get a vaccine in the near future, it will probably come from the pharmaceutical companies these two candidates often vilify. These critics might want to pause and consider that their criticisms are making a good case against government-run health care. I'm Kerby Anderson. That's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And once again, Jordan Raynor with us as we talk about his book, Master of One. And it does seem to me that before we get into some of the specifics, you do deal with a couple of lies that are really important. One is you can do anything you want to be, and you can be anything you want to be. I've heard that so often. You can do everything you want to do, and then your happiness is the primary purpose of your work. Talk about those for just a few minutes, because those are important issues, and this idea that I can be all things through Christ who strengthens me is really kind of a misunderstanding of that verse, isn't it?
Oh, man, we have really butchered what Paul intended with Philippians 4:13, but actually really appropriate for this time and this moment in responding to the coronavirus crisis. Paul's talking about being content, being able to do all things in terms of contentment regardless of his circumstances. But no, to go back to the lies for a minute, Kerby, I do talk about these three lies about career and calling that I think really keep us from focusing in our careers. One, you could be anything you want to be. So, Kerby, I'm 5'6". Until the 8th grade, all I wanted to do was play professional basketball. That wasn't in the cards for me. If I cared about excellence of my vocation, that was never going to happen. Number two, this lie that you can do everything you want to do, kind of ignoring the laws of time and trade-offs, which we obviously know is not true. But I think the most pervasive lie we tell young people about work is it's a subtle message, but I think we're telling people that their happiness is the primary purpose of work. You know, I'm a millennial. I grew up hearing every adult, well-intentioned adult in my life, tell me to follow my passions, follow my dreams, do whatever makes me happy in my career. And it turns out this is terrible advice, put simply because it doesn't work. Millennials have had more opportunity to, quote, do whatever makes us happy vocationally, And Gallup tells us that we are the least happy generation of all time at work. And in Master of One, I talk about why. There's a lot of good academic data now that says that the number one predictor of somebody describing their work as a calling as opposed to a job or a career is not whether or not they were passionate about the work before they started it. It's the number of years you have spent practicing your craft. Passion is a side effect of mastery. We get to love what we do by getting really good at it, which I don't think should come as a huge surprise to Christians who model our lives after Christ, who came not to be served, but to serve, right? So I think there's a much more effective and God-honoring strategy here of following your gifts, focusing first and foremost on the work that is going to make others happy, that is going to serve others well. That's what's going to lead to the most sustainable joy for yourself in your vocation.
What about what you talk about in chapter 2 of this idea of proclaiming the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness? This is this idea that, if nothing else, we should have a character of excellence, and it is something that certainly surfaces time and time again in 1 Peter, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. You see all throughout Scripture this theme of glorifying God as being central to what we are designed to be as his image bearers. We turn around the word glorify a lot in the church. I think a lot of people can have a hard time wrapping their head around what exactly that means. I think it means a lot. I think it means being obedient to the Lord's commands. But I think it also means, John Piper says the essence of to glorify is to reveal the character of God, to reflect his greatness, right? And look around us. Creation is excellent. When God created, he did it with excellence, and thus we as his image bearers should have the highest standards for excellence what we do, because excellence isn't just a means to some end, a paycheck or a promotion or whatever it is. Excellence is a means of showing people what God is like, of being his image bearers, right? So to glorify God in our work, I think at the most fundamental level, is just doing our work as excellently as we know how. And it's hard to do that when we're distracted in a million different directions vocationally. We got to pick a lane. We got to stick with something long enough to get world class at it as a means of reflecting his greatness and serving our neighbors.
Let's see if we can maybe talk about how you've put the book together, because one of the first stories you tell is of Tony Dungy, and he's been in the studio with us before, but you talk about Cynthia Marshall, who's the CEO of the Dallas Mavericks, Mr. Rogers, of course, C.S. Lewis, and others. What you try to do is give us some role models. Some of them are contemporary role models. Some of them are biblical figures. But in each particular case, you give us a little bit of a hint of what this looks like in terms of trying to develop the mastery of one.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I learn by stories. I think most people learn by stories. So I didn't want to write a book that was just a straight, textbook. I wanted to exemplify what genuine Christ followers think about this topic of excellence and how they practically found their lane, focused on it, committed to it, and mastered their craft. You mentioned Fred Rogers. I think he's one of the most compelling examples of this. Mr. Rogers started his career in a lot of the same ways that we do today. He had tons of different interests. He wasn't sure where he was going to focus his time and his energy. But once he saw television, he saw a unique opportunity to combine all of his varied interests in a single direction that would serve people really well. And once he saw that, he tripled down on it. He put all of his eggs in that basket and focused on becoming world-class at his craft and really honing what I outlined in the book as the 3 keys to mastering anything vocationally. So these people, C.S. Lewis is a great example, Fred Rogers, Cynthia Marshall, Douglas Gresham, C.S. Lewis's stepson, Tony Dungy. These people were world-class at their craft, but their primary motivation was service to neighbor. It wasn't to accumulate fame and fortune. It was to serve. Fred Rogers said, you don't set out to be rich and famous. You set out to be helpful. I think that's a really, really good way of thinking of our vocations as Christ followers.
Jordan Raynor with us as we talk about his book, Mastery of One. And let's, if we can, get into some of those keys. First of all, you talk about the path to mastery to start with the one in mind, because, first of all, everybody says, well, I'm doing all sorts of different things. Yes, but what's the one thing? So part of it is a mindset, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a mindset, right? And listen, I talk in the book about professional experimentation is good. In fact, I think millennials, we're a little too hard on millennials who change jobs, 3 times in their first 5 years out of college. I think some of that's a good thing. We should try many things in order to find the work that we can do best. But the point is that experimentation has to be purposeful. That's why I say start with the one in mind. The purpose of vocational experimentation is to identify a singular lane that we're going to commit to and say, okay, I have enough data now. I think this is the work that I can do most exceptionally well in service of God and others. This is what I'm going to choose to master. So you mentioned the path to mastery, and this is what I've observed in the lives of people like Rogers and Lewis and Cynthia Marshall. Step 1 is experimentation, right? Trying a lot of different things.
Right.
Step 2 is choosing. Step 3 is cutting everything else out. And then step 4 is really not a step, but a lifelong process of mastery.
Yes. And again, we'll get into some of that. But one of the things that you talk about are the 3 questions. That comes from your previous book, Called to Create, which I would recommend to people as well. Because, the questions are, what am I passionate about? What gifts has God given me? And where do I have the best opportunity to glorify God and serve others? And so a question about passion is appropriate, especially when it's tied into your gifts and your callings. You may be passionate, like you said, about being an NBA guard, but don't think that's played out that well. So, but at the same time, passion isn't completely to be ignored, whether it is dirty jobs or other people talking about this false idea that go towards your passions because you may really suck at what your passions are.
Exactly.
But those are important questions to ask as you're trying to kind of figure out what you need to do the rest of your life.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And here's the deal. Here's the trick about passions, right? They're really good signposts to what we might be gifted at. Very few people like doing work that they're not good at, right? There's certainly exceptions to that rule.
Right.
Right?
Sure.
The passions are really good indicators of, okay, keep moving in this direction. Try these things and get validation from others that you're gifted at it. So, yeah, I think everybody has their own definition of calling, and the Bible doesn't spell it out for us super clearly, right? But the Scripture does make clear that God has wired certain interests into our hearts and how he's uniquely designed us. It also makes clear that we've all been given different gifts. And I think that the key is figuring out where those things overlap in the best place to exercise those gifts and passions in service of others. And notice I didn't say the right decision, the right path. I think too often we treat vocation and calling as kind of the way Hollywood treats Mr. and Mrs. Right, that there's this one magical person in the world that is going to fulfill all of my needs. And that's just not true in marriage. And it's also not true in vocation. I love my wife, but before I committed to marrying her, there were probably dozens of people in this world that would have been compatible partners for me, right? But I had to make a choice. At some point, I had to say, she is the best choice I can possibly make. And once I made that choice, I was able to flourish.
We're going to take a break, and we'll talk about more Explore, Choose, and Eliminate. All that coming up right after this.
(2020). Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation with Jordan Raynor. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Maybe you have a question. If not, I just encourage you to kind of sit back and listen. I know especially when so many of you are sequestered, I've heard from many of you that you actually are listening to Point of View more than ever. And so this is something that we wanted to do to encourage you to be all that you can be and to pursue excellence in anything that you do. And Jordan, one of the sections that you talk about, Chapter 5, is explore. You've already talked about that a little bit, but you have this great quote from Fred Rogers. You rarely have time for everything you want in this life, so you need to make choices, and hopefully your choices can come from a deep sense of who you are. And so I still run into individuals, especially when I speak to college students, which I did about 2 weeks ago, but even adults who are still trying to figure out, as I say, what I'm going to do when I finally grow up. Part of that is explore, because when we were trying to reconnect with you, I told my own story that if in some respects, let's take your age you were talking about when you were a master of none at age 25, there was nothing at age 25 that would tell me I would be doing what I'm doing right now, which is radio, which I've been doing for a third of a century now. And so in some respects, explore is important because it may not even necessarily be on your horizon, but as you explore, you begin to find things that you're good at, things that begin to meet a very significant need. And so your passion and the need connect up. And now you have that joy that you really experience once you're in the will of God.
That's exactly right. Explore is so important. How can we make the best choice of the work that we're going to commit to master unless we've explored a lot of different options, right? And I would imagine a lot of people listening to the show today probably already have a full-time job, right? They have a 9-to-5. Maybe they've been in a career for, 5-10 years. But even there, if you're not confident that this is the work you want to be doing or you feel called to be doing in this season of your career, I encourage a lot of people in those situations to place little bets. Right. So in the book, I outlined 5 principles of effective experimentation. And I think that's a good one. And frankly, one that's really relevant in this day and age. If your hour-and-a-half long commute is gone, you just got 90 minutes back. We wouldn't wish the circumstance on anybody, but you got 90 more minutes a day to place a little bet on writing a novel, right, or starting a business from home. Take advantage of that time. If you don't think your full-time job is your one thing, to place a little bet, to try something, to get a little bit of data, to move closer to that sweet spot of your gifts and your passions.
And again, I love that. 5 principles of effective experimentation. You talked about place little bets, embrace being Jack or Jill of all trades.
Temporarily,
fail fast. I love that. Go where you will learn the most and keep your one thing in mind, because in some respects that is the case. And I might just mention, as individuals get your book, there's a chapter summary, there's usually a key verse or so, and then there's a next action item. So all of those come together so that as you work your way through this individually, this is something that you can begin to discover, but you may want to do this with somebody else. Maybe it's a small group, or maybe it's just a spouse or a friend, because oftentimes I have found, and Jordan, I'm sure you would agree with this, the best advice you sometimes get from someone else is for somebody to see what should be obvious to you but isn't. My favorite story is another individual that does broadcasting told me that when he was a young boy, somebody said, you got a great voice for radio. You might be really good at that. And it was that question, that suggestion, that thought that really launched him into a career that he's done all these years. So sometimes spending some time with a mentor or a friend or a peer, they might give you some perspective as well as we talk about this whole idea of explore. But let's look at the other one, and that is Chapter 6 talks about choose. Dorothy Sayers said, "Blessed are the single-hearted, for that is the real meaning of the word we translate the pure in heart. If your heart is not wholly in the work, the work will not be good, and work that is not good serves neither God nor the community. It only serves mammon. So this idea of choosing, sometimes it's hard to choose, but of course you give us many examples of people that made that choice and made it work.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think a lot of people in today's day and age are afraid to choose because, frankly, we have so many options. We have more options for our work than we ever have before, and so there can be this sort of paralysis of analysis, if you will. But I tell people all the time, I was like, listen, if you're at a place where you feel like you've gotten enough data and you think, all right, this is the thing. This is the thing that I want to choose to commit to. You remember a couple of things. First, remember there's no right decision for your career. We talked about this a few minutes ago, right? God has given us choice. God has given us freedom, right? We all have this general call to glorify God, to love neighbor as self, to make disciples of Jesus Christ, right? But within that, we have a lot of freedom, right? So there's no right decision for your career. Second, I would just be encouraged by the fact that there are very few irreversible decisions, right? So if you choose this path today and 2 years down the road, you find something that is a better expression of your passions and gifts, you can pivot to that other path. Right? And the third thing I would encourage people to remember before they make this choice is that if we desire to do our most exceptional work and make our greatest contribution to the world through our work, I believe there is an imperative to make a decision. Now, you could disagree with that. You could disagree with the master of one strategy, but I think it's really hard to disagree with the biblical mandate for excellence in all things and all things for God's glory, right? And so this book is one strategy of how I think we can express that. And I do believe there is this imperative to make hard decisions, as Fred Rogers said, out of a deep sense of who we are.
And again, Colossians 3:23, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. And that is certainly a great reminder that even though we are obviously working for an employer, working for a job, we're doing it ultimately to please the Lord. And so before we take a break, let's talk about one more, because we've talked about this idea of explore and choose, now eliminate. That one is the tough part, because we do have some probably pack rats out there that have never eliminated anything. There are some that would like to do all sorts of different things simultaneously, and yet you give us really a help on the process of elimination. Take us through that, if you might.
This is the hardest part, I would argue, Kerby, right? And I feel like Jesus is a really good model for this in the Gospels, a really good example that in order to do our best work, we've got to get in the habit of saying no. I think Jesus said no frequently throughout the Gospels, not to bad things, but to good things that weren't essential for him. Mark chapter 1 is a really good example of this, right? So after Jesus healed a bunch of people outside of Peter's mother-in-law's house, they all went to bed, came back on day 2, and were looking for an encore on day 2 of Jesus healing them. And Jesus says in Mark 1:38, no, let us go somewhere else so I can preach there also. That is why I have come, right? So Jesus didn't come just to heal and reveal his identity. His essential mission, or if you want to put it in the vernacular of this book, his one thing was to preach the gospel in word and deed, of course, ultimately on the cross. And because Jesus was clear on that, on what he was saying yes to, he was able to get in the habit of consistently saying no to good but non-essential things that were competing for his time and attention. Healing people was a good thing. I think we can all agree. Jesus did that on the first day, right? But on that second day, he said no, because he had more essential work ahead of him, right? So if Jesus can't say yes to everything, neither can we. Once we get clear on the work that we are choosing to do for God's glory and the good of others in this season of life, we got to get really good at saying no to other things. I think the most practical key to doing that is having people around you who know what you're saying yes to vocationally, who can keep you accountable and keep you away from distracting side paths, from mastering your one thing.
Very good. Again, say yes to the essential. Of course, those are the things that we see in Jesus. And of course, then say no to the non-essential. And as you said, beware of side paths that will take you in a direction the wrong way. Let's take a break, and we've spent some time talking about the purpose of mastery, the path of mastery, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more about the promise of mastery and what it really means to master in the first place. So there's a lot of material that we're covering here in the book, but if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to get a copy of that, we have information about that on our website. The book has just come out. It's published by Waterbrook, so you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. But if not, we have a link there so you can get it both in hardback and in Kindle. It's out in this year of 2020, and I just thought it would be something that as you are kind of reevaluating where you are, maybe listening right now because you aren't able to get out of the house, maybe are rethinking your own career, I thought this would be a real helpful book. And, of course, we are indebted to Jordan Raynor for taking us through his experience and through his discussion of this book. We'll continue right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, for a few more minutes, Jordan Raynor with us, and you might want to go to his website, jordanraynor.com, to connect up with him. Might also want to check out his other book, Called to Create. Of course, we also have a link to Threshold 360, so just some great resources available to you. And let's talk about what it means to actually master, not only be a master, which is the noun, but the verb. You talk about apprenticeships, for example, that are one part of that, and then you talk about purposeful practice, as well as the other concept of discipline over time. So what does it mean to actually be a master of one?
Yeah, good question, Kerby. So my team did a ton of research for this book. We studied, obviously, God's Word. We did interviews with world-class masters. We studied academia, business literature. And over again, these 3 keys to mastery kept coming up, right, as the keys to mastering really anything vocationally. The first key is apprenticeships, kind of a lost art in some ways in today's economy. And, some apprenticeships look different than others. Some of them look traditional, where I go and apprentice under a master who gets to know me personally in a direct relationship. And the other is an indirect apprenticeship, right? So this is what we do when we self-teach our stuff on YouTube, right? Or Coursera or Masterclass, whatever it might be. But apprenticeships, this idea of humbly admitting, once you've chosen what to commit to, that, hey, I don't know everything. There are other people whose expertise is very real, and having the humility to submit yourself to their expertise. That's key number 1. Key number 2 is purposeful practice. I'm sure a lot of people listening right now are familiar with the famous 10,000-hour rule, right? It takes 10,000 hours of practice to get world-class at anything. What a lot of people don't realize, though, it's not just any practice. It's purposeful practice, which distinguishes itself in that, 1, you have to set specific goals. Number 2, you have to be intensely focused on the task at hand when you're practicing. Number 3, you got to get rapid feedback. And then number 4, purposeful practice requires frequent discomfort, right? So masters always put more weight on the bar. They never settle, right? So purposeful practice is key number 2. And then the final key to mastery is maybe the most rare, is just discipline over time. Not just choosing a career and falling in love with it, but staying in love with it, staying committed to it for a long period of time, long enough to get to those 10,000 plus hours of purposeful practice until you get really world-class in service of others in your craft.
Just before we run out of time, let's talk about the third section, the promise of mastery. And you talk about this idea of salt and light and the room where it happens and share the master's happiness. Talk about that for just a minute, because in some respects, that's the concluding aspect of this whole journey that we're talking about.
Yeah, so I'll touch on the salt and light concept. Jesus, your listeners are obviously familiar with this term, right? Jesus calling the church to be the salt of the earth, the light of the world. And I would argue that excellence in our work is one of the ways in which we become salty in the world. Excellence is attractive. I think excellence makes people winsome. Like, think about the people in your life that you've been drawn to in the past, that you've gone to for advice. It's probably people who have demonstrated some level of mastery of their craft, right? So excellence makes us salt of the earth. And when people are drawn to us because of that salt, it gives us an opportunity to shine the light of the world, namely Christ. Tony Dungy, who you mentioned before, the NFL Hall of Fame coach,
sure.
I talked about him in this chapter, about, he won the Super Bowl, and he's standing there with tens of millions of people listening. He's salt of the earth. He's attractive. He's winsome. People want to know what he's going to say, and he takes that opportunity to shine the light to Christ and explain that the Lord is his motivation for excellence and the reason why he does everything he does. Such a beautiful picture of how mastery makes us salt and light in this crazy world we're living in right now.
Let's talk about what we can find on your website, because you've got some great resources in the back of the book. Of course, you do have a link there as well, and that is one of the things that you would certainly recommend that people go to jordanraynor.com. Also, it's a good place to find out about your other book, Called to Create, and that is a bestseller. So talk about some of the resources that might be available to some of our listeners as they go to those websites.
Yeah, so everything me and my team are working on right now is to equip the church, to inspire and equip every Christian to do their most exceptional work for the glory of God and the good of others. So the books are one way of doing that. We have a weekly devotional that goes out every Monday morning that helps you connect the gospel to the work that you're about to do this week, right? That's free. We got 100,000 plus people that get that every Monday morning. And we also just launched a podcast recently called The Call to Mastery, where every week I'm talking to a Christian who is world-class at their craft. We talk about their path to mastering their one thing. We talk about their daily habits and routines. And we talk about how their faith influences their work. And these people come from a bunch of different professions, some world famous, some not. We've had Horst Schulte, the co-founder of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel Group, Carly Fiorina, the former presidential candidate and CEO of Hewlett-Packard. We've had a professional ballerina. We've had a world-class athlete. We've had the CEO of a photo booth company. So lots of different people doing really extraordinary work that is pointing towards the kingdom, that is pointing the lost people in their lives and the believers to the ultimate redemption of all things. I think the podcast is just a really good celebration of the good, eternally significant, important work we are all doing every day out in the marketplace and out in the world.
Again, the podcast, The Call to Mastery with Jordan Raynor. And again, we have information about him and all sorts of information about the book on our website. So, Jordan, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Kerby.
And again, as we are winding down for today, let me just encourage you to find out a little bit more. We had Patrick Morley on for the first hour as we talked about his book, The Christian Man. And then the second hour, Jordan Raynor, The Mastery of One. And I might just mention that we have Joel Rosenberg on tomorrow. We were hoping to have him in studio, but he's gone back to Israel, but he will be joining us by phone. And I might just, as a program note, mention that his new book, Jerusalem Assassin, is out. And we have purchased multiple copies, and one of the things we're going to be making available next week during our Truth Team Week is for your donation. You can receive a copy of the book. We'll also be making available some other things, including this flash drive that has, hundreds of various material, articles, resources, and those kinds of things. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. I think like 11 hours worth of recorded material, as well as all sorts of articles and things. So lots of facts, figures, stories, and all sorts of material, which we'll talk about tomorrow. But I just wanted you to know that we might make some of that available tomorrow, since we'll be talking about his book, Jerusalem Assassin. And as you go to the website, let me just real quickly mention a couple of things. First of all, this article that is by Matthew Continetti, Coronavirus Test America's Social Capacity. Is American society ready for the coronavirus pandemic? And the answer is, well, I'm not so sure about that, but I certainly wanted you to read that piece, which then is a perfect setup for the other one that we've posted by Peter Wolfgang, who actually argues that, if anything, Christians are probably best prepared, better prepared at least, he says, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually to weather the present crisis than many of the people around us. And he makes that case because he says, number one, we worship the great I am, not the great whatever, by committing to our Lord Jesus Christ, and by believing in God, we perhaps will be able to weather the storm better. And second of all, he says, well, we've been through this before, through all sorts of disorientation that has already taken place. So I wanted you to read the article. If nothing else, it just comes back to one of the statements I've heard many people make over the last couple of weeks. Maybe you've made it as well. I don't know how people can actually feel confident and have any kind of hope if they didn't have the Lord. And so wanted you to read some of those articles and encourage you to be listening tomorrow. It's going to be a great conversation with Joel Rosenberg and some others. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.